Several things. First of all, I am by profession a college teacher, and my grandfather is a Baptist minister. Okay, you get it. That means I can talk forever, but it also means, you know, I need the church to say amen periodically, and feel free to interrupt and or throw things, hopefully not throw things. Center for the Future of Museums. I'm reading about this. Join us for a symposium exploring how museums can help create healthy communities and use food as a medium to cultivate new audiences. Well, you've spent much of your day talking about the former. I'm going to talk about the latter. And drop things. We've talked about backing up the taco trucks, passing out the soup, about building chicken coops and urban farming. We've understood more about sustainability and about food justice and food deserts and access and barriers and race and class and some unspeakables and more. And as I looked at the listing of attendees, museums, I was sort of surprised to see children's museums, public garden spaces, historic houses, a few art museums, some natural history museums, some technology museums. And I realized that in some ways, we've been speaking to the front row of the classroom. I propose widening the lens and talking about food in a broader sense. I want to talk specifically to those of you who aren't convinced, who are still wondering, okay, yeah, but what's that really got to do with my museum? And so I want to begin by talking to you a little bit about some of the museums that I have visited, and some of the things that I have participated in, and some of the things that I thought, and then I'm going to go on from there and hopefully draw some conclusions and maybe give you some food for thought, and then, as a good professor should, I'm going to give you some homework. More than a decade ago, in the unlikely spot of the Tubman African American Museum in Macon, Georgia, I was startled to be made aware of just how vividly the use of food can bring a concept into focus. At an exhibit entitled Soul on Rice, they presented the culinary connections between Western Africa and the southern United States. In the then fledgling museum, under the direction of Carrie Pickard, who some of you may know, he's a member, or was a member, they created two display spaces. One recreated the cacophony and life of a West African market, complete with baskets of fresh ingredients such as yams, okra, beans, and more that were periodically refreshed by Che Ezekweche, the Igbo woman who was the museum board chair. An adjacent room featured the interior of a typical rural home in the South with the same foods: okra. The yams had been transformed into sweet potatoes, but more about that in a second. Beans, and more. And the interesting thing was that it was simple. It certainly depended on the goodwill and the ingenuity of the board chair who hauled and toted ingredients that made the exhibit work so vividly, but it was perfectly suited to the crowds of school children who visited and who could see the first connections between Africa and the New World vividly. This was then food in the museum context at its most simple. Last month, I visited Jane, and I don't know if she's here, at the National Museum of the American Indian at Elizabeth's behest. And there, Café Métissamé, that you've heard about earlier today, updated my thoughts and began to increasingly define the potential for the use of food and food studies in museum context. The café provides a gustatory continuation of the lessons learned. And the service lines, as you've no doubt heard, are divided according not to soups, salads, meats, and vegetables, but geographic regions of individual tribal groups, so that you can have that treat of fry bread in the southwestern region alongside a quahog chowder in the region that celebrates the Northeast. And it's further inflected seasonally and has a garden. So you've got all of those things that are answering all of the questions that we've talked about. And if that weren't enough, the display space outside has recently been given over to food-related exhibits and showcases, not only showing serving vessels, but a display of foods developed by native peoples that have become a part of our everyday life. Imagine being online to go to a cafeteria at a museum and seeing a box of cornflakes, and then reading the small print and realizing corn, domesticated by Native Americans, quinoa, sorrel, that thing that makes red zinger red, and so on and so forth, chilies, hot sauces, all of those things. So even on the line at the cafeteria, food is continuing a lesson. Last week I spoke in Atlanta at Emory University at a part of its museum's Yam Festival. Conceived by Elizabeth Horner of the Department of Education there, the festival took its inspiration from the traditional yam festivals of West Africa. Africa has a yam crucible. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the food of the continent, okay, this is when I get to step away from the mic for 2 seconds, and hopefully you will get it. Handy-dandy map of Africa. Senegal, South Africa. The yams are along in the cellulite zone. Okay, so the thing about that yam festival is it celebrates the traditions of that part of the world. It connects not only with Africa, with the continent, but it equally connected with that community. Atlanta has a large Igbo community, a large Nigerian community, and a large Ghanaian community. So the Igbos and the Yoruba from Nigeria and the Ghanaians all have yam ceremonies. Imagine what it was like. It was a week-long ceremony, and they had home cooks who came and did demonstrations on the yard and talked about tales and of yams. We don't have yams in the United States. Those things that we have, those of you who are from botanical gardens know this. We have sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are New World, yams are Old World, yams are native to Africa. You have never had a candied yam at Thanksgiving. You have had a candied sweet potato. And if you haven't shopped in an African, an Asian, or a Hispanic market, you've probably never even seen a yam. So my talk was about just that confusion, but all of it within the context of the yam ceremony. Now, as you all know, Julia Child's Kitchen is one of the top draws at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And yes, following the popularity of the book and the film Julie and Julia, which some of you have no doubt seen, people leave butter and notes. And the spot has ultimately become a shrine to America's culinary history. But now, how wonderful is that? And think about the visitors that come to the shrine, and then think about your own community. Who are your culinary elders? Who are your shrine leaders? Who are the people who deserve to be given totemic status in your museum, where people can come and visit, where people can pay homage? Washington, D.C., like much of the country, has gone food mad, and the exhibit America Eats at the National Archive has spawned its own extremely popular pop-up restaurant. Yeah, a pop-up restaurant. It's called America Eats, and it features dishes from the country's past. And it's probably a unique case of a museum exhibit that, has spawned an ancillary visit. I mean, not an ancillary visit, but an ancillary business. And the business, which is extremely popular, is now showing signs of outliving the exhibit that created it. Not bad. More than simply the cafe. Somewhere else, partnering with chefs. Now, that may be extravagant, but what about just that, partnering with a chef in your area to create a menu that celebrates an exhibit, that celebrates something that you are showing, or something that you have, or something that you are growing, or a particular season where you work in tandem? Food is increasingly becoming a focal point within the museum context. Certainly, we must ask ourselves why. Now, we've talked about sustainability, we've talked about learning about food, we've talked about teaching, we've talked about all of those things. Here's another thing. I spoke once with a friend whose wife was dying of cancer, and noticed that the Food Television Network was playing in the background. And I sort of commented on it, and he replied succinctly and brilliantly, "There's no bad news on the Food Network." And in these times, Food offers us a potential for good news in a world where good news is increasingly rare. Food is also a potent connector of people and of ideas, as you have seen. Food is one of the few true connectors that we have. I teach at Queens College in New York City, and there more than 183 languages are spoken. I'll say it again, more than 183 different languages are spoken. This, then, is the America of the future. And I can tell you that one of the few things that we will have in common is food. Perhaps not in the sense that we all share the same plate, in the sense that my Dominican and Colombian students can all talk about la bandera, that wonderful plate of rice and beans and meat and a salad. Although 2 semesters ago, I had a girl who manifestly looked Asian stand up. And one of the assignments I give my students is describe your favorite dish. Well, she stood up and talked about la bandera. Because I am Dominican, she said proudly. Well, the Latino Dominican students' jaws dropped pretty much about as far as mine dropped, and I realized the world is changing. She was Chinese, but born and raised in the Dominican Republic. Okay, so we're having multi-inflections of race and ethnicity, and this is all showing up not only in the plate, but in the classroom and in your museums. So think about this. Connector. We might all share a common love of rice. Great subject for an exhibit. We might share a fondness for potatoes. Why not? We can connect over these communalities, and sharing them allows us to be more open to understanding our differences. Food also tells us where we are. What are the totemic dishes of a city or of a region? We want to sample cheesesteaks in Philadelphia, wings in Buffalo, and po' boys in New Orleans. The Atlanta History Center was working, and I think still is, on a barbecue exhibit. What better place? It's totemic of the South. Food may even tell us why we are here, or why we are where we are. The growth of the sugarcane industry in the hemisphere is directly related to enslavement. The Croatians, the Vietnamese who migrated to southern Louisiana and the Gulf Coast came because of their knowledge of fishing and shrimping. And of course, Columbus, took a left when he should have taken a right. And most of us are here as a result of that, whether by design or by force. Most importantly, food tells us who we are. Our history, whether we are black, white, red, or yellow, always, and I mean always, turns up on the plate. It's the rice on the table of South Carolina aristocrat or a Sea Island Geechee. It's the apricots in a Sephardic Passover haroset that speak of northern Africa. It is even the absence of swine on the plates of many African Americans for whom the pig and its meat are connected with the travails of enslavement. Now, the discipline of food studies is a growing one in the academy, with programs springing up all around the country like the proverbial mushrooms after a spring rain. But the discipline is fluid and in scope can overlap with more traditional ones, from anthropology to zoology. But it also touches on newer disciplines that reflect world concerns, such as environmental studies and ecology. People are talking about food. Food is cardinal, and the United States has become a nation of foodies, and God knows it's a term I hate, but that's what we have become. On the web, which has become our major communications highway, it's an international obsession, and it's an obsession that is a growing part of this country's national ethos. Comment, communication is constant, not to say relentless. I am a member, somewhat reluctantly at times, of Chefs Helping Chefs, Moroccan Cooking, Jewish Cooking, Black Culinary Historians, the Brown Culinary Experience, which it took me several weeks to realize had nothing to do with Brown University, but everything to do with brown people. It's about cooking by Latinos and African Americans and so on and so forth. Then there is the listserv of the ASFS, the American Society for Food Studies. There, food scholars from all over the world post on everything from the mundane, a young lady from Spain doing food history asking for a job, to the esoteric, a posting on an upcoming book about the food of the enslaved in Cuba's ingenios, or their sugar plantations. Now, I mention that because ASFS is a perfect resource. You can sign on to the listserv without being a member. There you can get some of your culinary questions answered, but you can equally find local speakers. It can work all sorts of ways. Food can take us into the past with a study of trade routes, individual ingredients, patterns of eating, and more. And when it touches on issues such as sustainability and food justice, it takes us straight to tomorrow's headlines. Food, therefore, allows us all to come to the table in many different ways. And in this era of increasing diversity, when budgets are being cut and require sustaining by public interest, museums are often perceived of as being elitist. Food, as the ultimate connector, can be crucial. Some of you know that eons ago, those of you who had dinner with me last night know more than that, but eons ago I was a theater major. And from those days, I recall that there was a theory of theater developed by the great French comic playwright Molière, who posited that theater should plaire et instruire, please and instruct. And indeed, it would seem that in this, theater and museums share common mission. Museums of the past might add curate and conserve, while those of the future will certainly add nurture and sustain. In this, food can aid with the mission of virtually any museum. And here I want to emphasize that I am speaking not only of natural history or ethnographic museums, but of all museums. At an art museum. If Julia Child's kitchen is so popular, think of the possibilities of looking at Monet's kitchen in Giverny. It's spawned a whole line of culinary products, not to mention the chairs are for sale in replica, the tables, and so on and so forth. Remember Archimboldo's complex paintings and his amazing use of food. Never forget that Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec actually authored a cookbook. Then there are the possibilities of exhibits related to food in art, such as Zoubaran's food, as well as the food shown in all of those other still life artists. Perhaps it's a museum-wide look at fast foods or comfort foods, from the foods of the Egyptian section all the way through Claes Oldenburg's hamburgers. It could be a look at a beverage or a drink. Remember, the Egyptians brewed beer. Those at the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania have gotten good currency out of discovering Egyptian beer, and they actually brew a beer based on an Egyptian recipe. Children will be intrigued to find the ingredient on a treasure hunt inspired by what can be found in various paintings, in various objects, in various parts of your collection. Perhaps it will come complete with a museum-generated children's cookbook that uses the ingredients in various dishes. Culinary and historian Andrea Leaf has done extensive work on the food of the Impressionists. And a decade or more ago, French editor Flammarion came out with a series of works. The Table of Renoir, The Taste of Giverny, celebrating the Impressionists' table, Cézanne and the Provençal table, Picasso, Bon Vivant. All of these books in which the artist's culinary preferences were detailed along with images and recipes would make for perfect exhibits, highlighting the collection's artists, or even a high-end donor dinner. Remember the donor dinners about the last night on the Titanic, Babette's Feast. People love to go out and eat food from the past. You can do this. It doesn't have to be Renoir. You may be in a museum that is a gazillion miles away from the nearest Renoir, but you've got something that you can celebrate at the table. Science and History Museum? Never forget the Field Museum's chocolate Blockbuster. 2002. It was called by the American Anthropologist's Journal a highly appealing and worthwhile museum experience that will educate young and old visitors alike. It has traveled for 10 years and has just returned to Chicago after appearing at 22 other venues. It uses more than 200 objects and replicas, immersive exhibits, interactives, media, and is, a bilingual exhibit. Another thing to think about in terms of the future. Chocolate is amazing, and it's now even only open for booking in 2013, booked all the way through then. Now, other ingredients: salt, sugar, tea, coffee, corn, chilies, and more. And it doesn't have to be that same scope. It doesn't have to be a natural history museum. Tea implements. What did people serve tea with? How was tea used? Where did it come from? Who migrated? Did people, change cultures, move boundaries to work with tea? All of those things. Possibilities and potentials for any museum. You've got coffee growing right up there. Okay? So there are all sorts of things to think about. In Boston, a group has begun work on food and an oral history radio project called Kitchen Conversations. It's a sort of StoryCorps-esque booth that travels to food-related events in the area and gathers oral history. The oral histories are then kept in the Museum of Science. Had tremendous success. Something else that you can think about: make your neighborhood part of your exhibit. How do you do that? What do they do? Where do you do that? All of those questions that you ask your elders. A, it empowers your neighborhood elders. B, it lets them know you're there if they don't. C, it also lets other people have a sense of belonging. It gives people a part and a way to buy in, if you will. One of the inaugural shows for New York's Museum for African Art was initiated at the Gibbs Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. It featured Gullah basket work from the South Carolina Low Country and its African counterparts. Think connections. I don't know if she's still here, but yes, she is. I'd forgotten your name, but the lady in the back handed me a calendar. She's talking about native Italian immigrant gardens in Pittsburgh. Well, how wonderful is that? It gives you a sense of Pittsburgh. Where are the communities? Who grows what? What are they growing? Why are they growing that? Where are they from? Why did they come here? All of those questions that can be answered in a museum and need to be answered in a museum in order for museums to be relevant to that community. And my favorite example, the new museum in Soho in New York, eons ago, did a presentation of a Belgian artist, Wim Delvoye's art. He's a person who does installations. And this installation is the kind of perfect art exhibit. I talked to Beth Merritt about it. It would work in a natural history museum, a museum of technology, and of course it was in an art museum. In a series of funnels and conveyor belts, tubes, pumps, and beakers, the installation replicated the human digestive system, complete with computer-monitored enzymes, bacteria, acids, and the like. It was fed twice daily. People food, real. It got a Belgian meal for its first meal. It went through garbage disposal, and at the end of a 27-hour-long digestive process, it pooped onto a conveyor belt. Now, what child wouldn't be fascinated by that? I know I was fascinated by that, but by then it had moved on to New Zealand. But think broader. Food is not just something growing or something showing. It's everything. Small museums will find that food offers exhibit possibilities with the potential for big draws about the food of a region, complete with a cooking demonstration, like that yam presentation, that yam festival. Connected with the concepts or the ideas of someone connected with the historic house. Hull House and soup is a perfect example. Farm museums are intimately connected to the soil and remind us that last night's dinner actually started out in the dirt and on the hoof, claw, or fin. In this world that is increasingly disassociated from the origins of the food that we eat, they have a powerful message to offer. It kind of sort of goes without saying. Botanical gardens and public gardens are also ideal venues at which to remind the public not only of the food concerns of sustainability, food justice, and our national slide from agriculture to agribusiness. They are also the perfect places to remind us of the healing power of food and of the power of plants to connect us profoundly with each other. I talked to you briefly about rice, but I once attended a rice meal at which representatives from various ethnic groups were charged with bringing in a dish from their culture that used rice. Imagine the potential in a public garden space. You've got the rice, you've got the people. Obviously, there are all sorts of service issues. We can't do this. We have to get our food service company to do that. We can't have a potluck supper, but we can have recipes. We can have an exchange. We can get together over a common ingredient and find out how this ingredient binds our community. And then there is ethnobotany, the history and background of the plants and the various plants that truly celebrate who we are. If I had my business cards, and I unfortunately am someone who is old enough to forget to network, so I never bring cards, but they have okra on them. And the okra represents my African origins. An increasing number of museums, large and small, are actually devoted to food, both individual foodstuffs, such as the Mustard Museum, or ethnic foodstuffs, like the Soul Food Museum in Atlanta. Others take a more general tack, like the culinary initiatives at the late Copia in Napa, California, where food and food-related exhibits range from ceramic plates that in blue and white sort of Delft China-esque version detailed the last meals of death row inmates. Art created from candies, penny candies of all sorts. I mean, masses and mounds of it, and you walk in and you can, sort of smell the sugar. You almost get a sugar rush from just walking into the room. Chocolate, chocolate sculpture. If you expand and think of food in the larger, the macro, rather than the micro, you see that there are ample possibilities. Just about everything connects to it. Oral histories at Copia were looped on video screens at the entrance, and they celebrated the breadth and depth of the food and foodways of the United States. Now, I'm leaving tomorrow and heading to food-driven New Orleans, where there are several programs in which I'm involved. More food for thought. The Ogden Museum of Southern Art are working in conjunction with the Dillard's Ray Charles program on a food and film series. Get people in there after hours. Show them some food films. Food films we've shown, like Water for Chocolate, Babette's Feast, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, Tortilla Soup, which is simply Eat, Drink, Man, Woman transformed into a Mexican-American context, same plot. Woman on Top, Penelope Cruz's first movie in English. In spring, we hope to show Donna Flor and Her Two Husbands, The Big Night, a Russian film about Georgia's chef in love. The museum celebrated food, and working in conjunction with Dillard's food provider, which is Sodexo, we provided little tastes of food that came from the museum. The turtle soup from Babette's Feast. A few Indian dishes to go with an Indian film that I've forgotten. Oh, Mistress of Spices. Like Water from Chocolate, we had some chocolate, Mexican style. The Ogden Museum is also working on a series for their Southern Storytellers program, where they're interviewing chefs publicly. A week from Sunday, I'm doing a public oral history interview with Leah Chase, who is the Dean of Black Creole Food in New Orleans. There are so many different possibilities. One of the inaugural exhibits at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans was an exhibit of antiquarian postcards depicting African Americans and food growing it, harvesting it, serving it, selling it in markets. Simple exhibit. Postcards, you blow them up, you put them on something, you got an exhibit, you put a caption, done. Basta. And every neighborhood, you've got the old postcards. You find somebody who collects them. It's a small show, but it's one that can travel to other smaller museums at minimal cost. There's a Caribbean and a Latin American version of it that's pending for other venues. The Museum of Southern Food and Beverage also houses the museum that we all want to visit, the Museum of the American Cocktail, okay, which talks about the history and development of that. It's kind of amazing when we think, if we really begin to think of food as other than something that just goes in our mouths, it's there. It's evident. It's part of your homework. The Historic New Orleans Collection has done very successful food exhibits, and it's also partnering a one-day food forum. We did one in 2010 on beans and rice. We're doing one in June, shameless self-promotion. Check their website for the date. It's going to be on pralines and Creole sweets. Local businesses, experts. It is not an expensive thing to put on, and it is the kind of thing that any museum or garden or historic house could do connected with the theme that you were involved with. And package it. Package it as a one-day trip. Package it as a weekend trip to visit your venue. Museum trips don't have to all be multi-thousand-dollar high-end prospects. There's money to be made from the smaller ones as well. And it is certainly undeniable that culinary trips should be added. Your museum members will want to travel with you to visit culinary venues. What about going to a sugarcane trip through Brazil and the Caribbean, or a rum tasting trip, or a beer tasting trip to Belgium? They're all possibilities. It doesn't just have to be going down the Silk Road or up the Nile. I'll never forget the few hours that I spent with the late Phyllis Bober on a stop at the Bardo Museum in Tunisia. The Bardo houses a lot of Tunisia's Roman mosaics. And the Romans did what they called dirty floor mosaics. And the mosaic patterns on the floors represented the things that the various Romans might have tossed out as they ate. So you see shells, you get shells as in seashells, as in empty clam shells, bones, smashed vegetables, all done in mosaic. So it's as though you were sort of peering down on the dirty dining room floor. Wonderful place, incredible thing, great exhibit, great potential museum trip with a specialist in the food of ancient Rome. Ways to use food as a connector and a driver of visitors are myriad and range from the creation of iPhone apps that connect food with your museum or garden's offerings to the creation of children's projects. Back at the Carlos Museum in Atlanta, in conjunction with an Egyptian exhibit, kids are mummifying fish. Cool. They bury them in salt, they do all sorts of things, they wrap them, they put them in herbs. What 8-year-old wouldn't enjoy that? That's awesome, exactly. It's like, cool, wow, yeah, that's amazing. But there are ideas like that. Talk to your teachers. Talk to your education department, obviously, first. But teachers, they're going to bring their kids, they may have some ideas for you. Talk to your art teachers, talk to your art students. All of these things are potentials. There are farmers market collaborations. Those parking lots that we're going to turn into gardens and farmers markets, absolutely. The survival of a museum, to steal an idea that was presented last night at dinner by the American Association of Museums' Michael Buddhadharma, is that it must stop being a temple and become a forum. Or as I probably would put it, it must become agora, a marketplace, a gathering point, a place of exchange. In that, it needs to link with community groups, create strategic partnerships with everyone from farmers working in sustainable agriculture to chefs who can celebrate this in their restaurant, to artists who do incredible installations that poop every 27 hours, to pastors. The power of mega churches to market is amazing. Plants of the Old Testament exhibit, anyone? Oh, we look for inspiration at schools, but we can also reach out across lines of gender, culture, ethnicity, and race. We need to think about moving from our national discourse as it currently is, which essentially was pilgrims, pioneers, slaves, cowboys, and Indians, to our national discourse as it is becoming, which is one of the immigrant experience. How do each of these two very different discourses intersect? And how do they intersect with the land? How can they intersect, and how can their intersections turn up in your museums? How does your museum respond to its own community? What are your regions or your people's sacred plants? We've heard about my okra. My summer stationery has watermelons on it now. That gives a whole lot of people pause. But there are also black-eyed peas and sesame and sorghum that are sacred plants to people of African descent. The three sisters, corn, squash, and beans, are sacred to Iroquoian peoples. What are the plants of traditional Chinese medicine and those of Ayurvedic medicine that are sacred to the Chinese and the Indians, respectively? What about your community? Who are its elders? Who are its wise men and women? Who are its religious leaders? And most importantly, are you talking to them? So, from the meticulous still lifes of Zubaran and the cloaca installation of Deloy, from the splash bar right here at the Phipps, where we've had that wonderful water that I've been sort of tanking up on like a thirsty camel, to the gardens at Café Métissan, to the African American food exhibit at the River Road African American Museum in Donaldsonville, Louisiana. Food, in all of its permutations, offers all of us a way to connect with our roots, quite literally, with our communities, and with our past and future. Think about it. Humans without food die. Perhaps museums without food might die as well. Food is necessary. It's sustaining, it's instructional, and it's fun. Just remember, always serve it up proudly. Thank you.